No one believed two K9 dogs could track their partner through a blizzard. But when an officer was ambushed, tied to a tree, and left to die in the snow, these loyal dogs refused to give up. What they did next will break your heart and restore your faith in loyalty. Officer Daniels had always believed he knew these woods better than anyone. He'd patrolled them for years, learning every trail and shortcut. But that morning, nothing looked familiar. Even the trees seemed to shift behind the curtains of swirling snow. Visibility was nearly gone by the time he realized he was no longer alone. The radio crackled weakly against his chest, too much static to call for help. He turned in a slow circle, heart beginning to hammer. Beyond the next ridge, the forest dropped into a narrow ravine. Snowmelt trickled somewhere beneath the drifts, muffled and hidden. He took a cautious step forward, squinting against the wind, just in time to see a shadow slip behind a tree. That was all the warning he got. In the next heartbeat, everything went black. Daniels came to with a pounding in his skull and the cold gnawing through every layer of his uniform. His vision blurred in and out until he saw ropes. Thick, rough cords looped tightly around his chest and arms, pinning him to the trunk of a massive pine that he tried to shift, but pain shot through his shoulder where he must have landed when they jumped him. Snowflakes landed on his lashes, melting into frigid drops. Slowly, he turned his head, scanning the clearing. They were gone, whoever had done this. But their footprints remained, a ragged path disappearing into the storm that he tested the ropes again, wincing. Too tight. His radio had been ripped away, tossed somewhere he couldn't see. The cold was already seeping into his bones, slowing his thoughts. Daniels swallowed hard, fighting the rising panic. He knew how fast exposure could kill. Out here, alone, he wouldn't last long. That he closed his eyes, forcing his breath steady, and prayed someone would come. Even then, he didn't know help was already racing through the snow toward him. Back at the station, two German shepherds paced inside the kennel, their restlessness building with every passing minute. Max and Shadow were more than partners. They were family. And both knew, in that wordless, instinctive way dogs always do, that something terrible had happened to Daniels. The handler on duty, Officer Reyes, watched them with a sinking feeling. Normally, Max waited patiently for commands, and Shadow would curl up in the corner, conserving his energy. But now, both dogs were pressed against the gate, ears pinned back, eyes fixed on the door as if they could see straight through it into the storm. Reyes clipped a lead to Max's collar and felt the dog surge forward, muscles straining. He'd never seen them so determined. When he opened the gate, Shadow slipped past him, nose to the ground, already searching. "Easy," Reyes called, but neither dog slowed. They were on a mission. Max stopped near Daniels' squad car, sniffing. The snow crusted over the tire tracks. His head lifted, eyes locking on the wideout beyond the lot. Shadow let out a sharp bark. Once, twice, then bolted into the wind. Reyes had no choice but to follow. The dogs weren't going to wait for permission to save their friend. Snow swallowed nearly every trace of the path, but to Max and Shadow, the trail was bright as a painted line. Noses low, they weaved through drifts and around frozen shrubs, their paws kicking up white powder with every stride. Reyes struggled to keep up, boots sliding across hidden ice. The wind stole his breath and numbed his fingers, but he didn't dare call the dogs back. He could see it in the way their ears twitched, in the urgency that pulled them deeper into the woods. Daniels was close, and time was running out. They crested a ridge where the trees broke open into a clearing. Max paused, his breath steaming, and turned in a slow circle, tasting the air. Then he let out a low, mournful howl that sent a chill down Reyes' spine. Shadow caught the scent again and took off, cutting a determined path along the tree line. Every few steps, he glanced back to be sure they were following. As the snow thickened, the world shrank to a blur of white and gray. Still, the dogs pressed on, unstoppable. They weren't just working, they were fighting to bring their handler home alive. Shadow stopped so suddenly that Reyes nearly stumbled over him. The dog's entire body stiffened, tail pointing straight back. Max caught up a heartbeat later, circling a massive pine where snow had drifted almost waist-high. Reyes squinted into the white haze, heart hammering. Then he saw it, a dark shape slumped against the trunk. As he stepped closer, details came into focus. The blue of Danielle's uniform, the ropes biting into his arms, the raw skin where he'd struggled. Danielle's eyes fluttered open at the sound of paws crunching snow. He tried to speak, but his lips were cracked, the words frozen before they could leave his mouth. Max pressed his nose to Danielle's cheek, letting out a low, anxious whine. Shadow moved behind the tree, teeth working at the knots. "Hang on," Reyes shouted over the wind. He dropped to his knees, fumbling for his radio. Daniels managed the faintest nod. Even in his dazed state, he lifted one hand just enough to rest it on Max's shoulder. That small touch made Reyes's throat tighten. Against all odds, these dogs had found him in time. But the fight to save him wasn't over yet. Shadow didn't wait for orders. He wedged his powerful jaws around the thick rope, teeth sawing back and forth. Max stayed pressed against Danielle's chest, his warmth a small barrier against the deadly cold. Reyes tore off his gloves, fingers fumbling with the frozen knots. Each tug brought a low groan from Daniels, but he didn't pull away. His eyes stayed locked on Max's face as if the dog's steady presence was the only thing keeping him anchored to consciousness. At last, a length of rope snapped free, falling to the snow in a heavy coil. Shadow lunged for the next one, growling low as he chewed through the coarse fibers. "Almost there," Reyes panted. His own hands were numb, but he forced them to keep working. A final pull, a sharp crack, and Daniels slumped forward into Max's waiting paws. Reyes caught him around the shoulders. "We've got you," he murmured. Max licked Daniel's cheek, his tail giving a tentative wag. Shadow whined softly, pressing close. The radio crackled with the dispatcher's voice confirming. Rescue teams were minutes away. Daniels closed his eyes, leaning into the dogs. He was too weak to speak, but the relief in his face said everything. Bright headlights cut through the trees, flashing across the snow like a promise. Moments later, paramedics burst into the clearing, carrying blankets and equipment. Reyes stepped back as they surrounded Daniels, working fast to check his pulse and wrap him in thermal foil. Max and Shadow refused to move more than an arm's length away, their watchful eyes fixed on their handler. One medic looked up, voice tight with urgency. If they hadn't found him when they did, he wouldn't have survived another hour. Daniel's lips moved, a rasp of sound too faint to hear. Reyes knelt beside him, leaning close. "Say it again," he urged gently. Daniel's cracked voice came clearer the second time. "Good dogs." Max let out a soft, relieved bark, and Shadow rested his head against Daniel's knee as the medics prepared to lift him onto the stretcher. Days later, the hospital room was hushed except for the steady beep of monitors. Tears stung his eyes as he reached a trembling hand toward them. Max was first to move, pressing his big head into Daniel's palm. Shadow climbed carefully onto the edge of the mattress, curling close. "You boys saved me," he whispered hoarsely. They didn't need words to answer. Their eyes, full of fierce devotion, said everything. Months later, Daniel stood in the sunlit training yard, fully recovered. Max and Shadow flanked him on either side, their heads held high. Reporters snapped photos, but he didn't care about the cameras. He cared about the two loyal hearts that had refused to let him die alone. He knelt, hugging them both, his voice rough with gratitude. "I owe you everything."